So I think it's time to start. It's all quite different from the usual look of the auditorium, thanks to the pandemic. But it's very good to see you, a very warm welcome. My name is Ulrike Roesler, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the college and on behalf of Tibetan and Himalayan Studies in Oxford. It's a very special occasion today because in conjunction with the annual Aris lecture, which sadly we had to skip last year, but we can have it again this year, in conjunction with that, which is held every year in memory of Michael and Anthony Aris and their contributions to Tibetan and Himalayan studies, we are also celebrating the 21st anniversary of the Tibetan and Himalayan Studies program itself. The first post at Oxford, dedicated specifically to the field of Tibetan and Himalayan studies, was established in 2000, with Charles Ramble as the first post holder. Tibetan studies is therefore turning 21, so we are coming of age, if you want. To mark the occasion, we have organized an event in two parts. The first part will include two presentations and the Aris lecture here in the auditorium. For the second part, you will be invited to move from the auditorium to the dining hall at Wolfson for an anniversary party with Tibetan refreshments and snacks and Tibetan music. Before we can start, I need to remind us all that the pandemic is not over yet, and Wolfson College is asking us to wear a face covering here in the auditorium, which I think you're all doing wonderfully, and also to sit at a 1 meter distance. That's why we have all these funny signs on the chairs. The afternoon will start with a presentation by Daniel Woyan and René Ford on an interview project carried out over the past few years, documenting the emergence of Tibetan studies as an independent academic discipline in the West. This will be followed by Dr. Lama Jabb's observations on the role of Tibetan scholars in Tibetan studies. There will then be a coffee break of about half an hour before we move on to the annual Aris lecture, which starts at 5 o'clock back here in the auditorium and is delivered this year by Dr. David Pritzker, whom we are delighted to welcome back to Oxford. Before we hear about Tibetan studies in more recent times, I would like to begin with some general thoughts on the long-term trajectory of our field. While the establishment of Tibetan studies as an academic discipline in the West was a big and important step, we also need to keep in mind that the first scholars to engage in Tibetan studies are, of course, the Tibetans themselves. Tibet has its own tradition of scholarship, spanning more than a millennium. This scholarship is rich and diverse, covering not only religion and Buddhist philosophy, but also history, poetry and poetics, linguistics, art history, medicine, and geography, to name just a few fields of Tibetan scholarly writing. For us, as scholars of Tibetan and Himalayan studies, this raises the question how this indigenous Tibetan scholarship is related to what we do as academics today. One of the issues we need to reflect on in this context is the position of an academic engaging with a culture that is not necessarily their own. Scholars in fields such as anthropology or religious studies sometimes distinguish between an emic perspective that describes cultural elements as perceived within this culture and an ethic approach applied to analyze cultural phenomena in a comparative perspective and using categories that are imposed from the outside. These terms have been much debated, and they are used in slightly different ways by different scholars. But without delving too much into this debate, it seems important to me that we acknowledge that both the researcher and the members of a culture that is the object of study can make use of both angles, the emic and the ethic one. This is essential if we want to avoid a simplistic reading of the terms emic and etic, which are sometimes superficially associated with a more subjective and perhaps naive view within the communities under discussion, as opposed to the supposedly more objective outsider view of the researcher. Applied to the Tibetan context, this distinction could be misconstrued to mean that Tibetan scholarship is by definition traditional, reflecting the emic perspective, whereas the academic scholar of Tibetan studies is able to view Tibetan culture from a more analytical and somehow more sophisticated point of view. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Traditional and critical approaches are a matter of choice. In some cases, Tibetan scholars may aim at a traditional approach, while in other contexts, they may aim at critical reflection. For example, it has often been remarked that Tibetan hagiographical writing follows a very predictable pattern, and the life stories of Buddhist masters are products of pious intention rather than critical thinking. This is not a lack of scholarly ability on the side of the author of the hagiography. It is the result of the purpose of hagiographical writing, which is there to inspire and generate faith, not to engage critically with a religious tradition. On the other hand, we could name numerous Tibetan scholars of previous centuries who did use a critical approach, named and compared their sources, and discussed their value and credibility, just as any modern scholar would do. The 16th century historian Pabut Suklak Trengwa is known for the accuracy with which he studied historical source materials, such as, for example, Tibetan inscriptions from the time of the Tibetan Empire, more than 700 years before his lifetime. Authors of Tibetan biographies and histories, such as the 15th century scholar-monk Künga Gyaltsen or the 16th century Künga Drolchok, reference their sources by name and discuss discrepancies between them, as any good historian would do. In the fields of linguistics and philology, Tibetans have produced works on grammar and commentaries in which they discuss different readings in the manuscripts they used, applying methods that are not substantially different from those of a modern textual scholar. And, as Lama Jabb has shown in his 2015 article on Tibet's critical tradition, Tibetan writers were not afraid to reflect on the traditions of their homeland, thus adopting something like a conscious, ethic approach towards their own culture. It is therefore obvious that Tibetan scholars of the past have operated from both an emic and an ethic perspective, and apply these depending on the purpose and scope of their work. But what about the role of modern academic scholarship with research methods and approaches originally developed in Europe and America, and now also increasingly used by contemporary Tibetan scholars of Tibet? Academic scholarship has developed new tools and methodologies. It keeps asking new research questions and exploring alternative theoretical frameworks. Moreover, scholars today have the privilege of having access to a vast quantity of Tibetan textual sources in digital form, with search engines that enable us to find textual passages with a mouse click. On the other hand, scholars from outside Tibet will not have the complex background and nuanced understanding that comes from growing up within a culture. This is quite obvious when we look at the first attempts of Western travelers trying to understand and describe what they saw in Tibet. And in retrospect, we may be amused by the mistakes in their accounts or shake our heads over their biases and misconceptions. Westerners became interested in Tibet for a variety of reasons, such as religion, politics, or sheer curiosity. To give just one example, in the 16th and 17th centuries, missionaries went east with the aim to convey the message of the Gospels to the natives, or in the hope of finding Christian communities in Inner Asia, founded by the legendary Prester John, a patriarch who was believed to have ruled over a Christian kingdom somewhere in the East. Some thought that the three jewels of Buddhism, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, were in essence the same as the Trinity of the Christians, and so there must be some remnant of Christianity out there. But despite many errors in their understanding, missionaries were also among the first to develop a genuine interest in Tibet and the Tibetan people. For example, the early 18th century Jesuit Ippolito Desideri spent 5 years in Tibet. He learned the Tibetan language and wrote under the Tibetan pen name Gokargi Lama Ippolito, also the white-headed or white-haired Lama Ippolito, which is a pun because the Tibetans used to call themselves the black-headed Tibetans, so it's actually quite funny to have this white-haired Lama from the West. In addition to his mission to spread the message of the Gospels in Tibet, which remained largely unsuccessful, he also made it his mission to debunk wrong information about the Tibetans spread by his contemporaries. And he produced a detailed and insightful eyewitness account of Tibetan society, which is still of great historical value today. So we see here some first attempts at understanding and explaining Tibetan culture to Europeans at a time when hardly anything was known about Tibet and the Tibetan plateau here in Europe. In reviewing both the achievements and the limitations of earlier scholarship, we must acknowledge that none of the early European travelers worked on their own, but they acquired their knowledge through collaboration with local experts who taught them the Tibetan language, shared their insights into their own culture, and shaped the way the Western travelers understood Tibetan and Himalayan societies. Acknowledging the contribution of these local collaborators is one of the great desiderata in Tibetan studies and will be an indispensable task if we want to fully appreciate the contribution of local scholarship to our academic work. The Ladakh expert John Bray has undertaken some first steps in this direction by publishing a series of articles on the local people who worked with Westerners in Ladakh and who shaped and informed their scholarship. Clearly, those who have grown up in Tibet or the Tibetan-speaking parts of the Himalayas have a more immediate access to their world than those who haven't. However, growing up within a society does not automatically make us experts in all its aspects and knowledge systems. For example, I, as a German, have not absorbed every element of German culture. The emic perspective, if you want, of my family and social environment may differ from the emic perspectives of other communities within Germany. Moreover, an outsider can be an expert in many cultural aspects that are unfamiliar to me. For example, a Japanese scholar of medieval German poetry will have a better understanding of these sources than the untrained German reader. It therefore appears that both the insider to a culture and the scholar who has acquired the tools and skills to study it have access to specific aspects, but not necessarily always to the whole. Cultural understanding does not lie in the genes, it grows with experience. What does this mean for the academic engagement with Tibet? In my view, one of the conclusions is that we need to strengthen the collaboration between researchers from inside and outside the Tibetan cultural areas, to exchange knowledge and research methods, discuss our perceptions of the field, and build on the strength that each researcher can bring to the discipline. I would like to think of scholarship in terms of a joint enterprise of humanity, beyond ethnic and national boundaries, an ongoing dialogue between the many and varied partners who constitute an academic community. To make this dialogue fruitful, we will all need to approach it with some intellectual humility in recognizing our own limitations and learning from others. For me, this kind of intellectual curiosity, humility, and willingness to learn is the raison d'être of university research in general, and also of a university program in Tibetan and Himalayan studies. Thank you.
We are here to present a project that we joined a few years ago. Renee is the latest addition to the team member. And it's called Oral History of Tibetan Studies. And it was actually originated or initiated by Anna Sanalova and Rachel Griffiths. They both couldn't come, unfortunate reasons, again. But we try our best to sort of convey their message as well as ours. And yeah, we prepared a little PowerPoint for you to just introduce you to the project, to those who don't know about it. We have a video which will showcase some of the rich archive that we have collected over the last 4 or 5 years. And at the end, we're going to launch the website today, and I'm just going to walk you through the website, like how it functions, like what you can expect, how to find information that you maybe are looking for, maybe you didn't know that you were looking for. Renee is going to talk us through the first part, and go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for all of you being here, and I really enjoyed some of your interviews that I recognize your faces from the videos. So Anna and Rachel were DPhil students here, and they enjoyed getting to know their professors and learning the stories, their personal stories, and it inspired them to want to archive and record more stories from other professors, other scholars, other people in the fields of Tibetan studies, Buddhist studies, and so forth. And so they were able to find enough support with Ulrike's help and with some funding from the John Fell Fund. And we're able to start going around and interviewing over 40 people. And this project has developed into further website and hopefully sharing these recordings through other ways of articles and conference presentations to share. So I'm just going to walk, hopefully. Yeah. So we're really trying to preserve the recordings and transcriptions to share with everyone. There's just a wealth of information and experience that we've seen while we watch their videos ourselves, and hope that this can be brought out into the public. And mostly, sorry. We're hoping that they'll be online and more articles, perhaps a book, to showcase all of these videos. So in the first phase, we've taken over 40 interviews, and all these interviews have been recorded and transcribed and then uploaded onto the website to share. And we've been able to, Daniel mostly has edited each video to make them clean, but also to present them in a cohesive way so that nothing is lost from the stories that are shared. Also, we've requested some visual materials from particular people, and they've been able to share them, so we're going to also put these up on the website for others to see. And then a couple other scholars in North America have received funding from the Robert Ho Foundation, and they will start to interview people throughout North America in the next coming year or so. This part has been prolonged by COVID, so we're hoping that that will also include a larger constituency of interviews. Daniel will talk about our second phase here. But what we're noticing is that, and here's where most of the interviews have taken place so far, so we can see it's very centralized, and we're hoping to expand upon this including Asia. We've had some interviews from Australia already, but hoping to expand upon our already interviews that have occurred so far. And some of the main themes that we're seeing are the inspiration and the creativity that has come from life experiences as a way to spark an interest in Tibetan studies and to further it by going to have more education and then become a scholar in the field. Stay with us. Thank you. And another part of this that we really wanted to focus on was the development of the International Association of Tibetan Studies, which of course was partly supported by Oxford initially and with Michael Aris, and to see the original participants of the first conference in 1979, and to see how this conference has really grown along with the community within Tibetan studies. So that is one other theme that we've tried to approach through these interviews. And then another one is really the development of Tibetan studies at Oxford itself with Michael Aris and his family, and how that has really, we've seen an outgrowth of that potential that occurred starting back then. Another one is, as we mentioned earlier, women and Native scholars in Tibetan studies, and to see how it's changing and evolutions of the scholars themselves. And just lastly, for this section to tie up again to really two other themes that I just mentioned of Oxford hosting the first IS in 1979, and then Oxford itself. So these are two other points that we've really focused with the life history interviews, so that not only are the scholars discussing their kind of inspirations and their life stories, but also their relationship to Oxford or to the International Association of Tibetan Studies, and then going forward. And I'll hand it back over to Daniel, and he's going to share how we're going to go forward.
Right, so we have a phase 2 planned. So another 60 people sort of have been contacted or identified or recommended mostly. And so we hope to go all over the earth really to collect more interviews. And so there's going to be a lot of stuff happening in North America. So a lot of North American scholars are going to be interviewed by this sister project set up by Elaine and Hannibal. And we also work closely with like people who are very close to their professors. So for instance, we had one person interviewing Lokesh Chandra in Delhi on our behalf, and then sort of back and forth like how we should set up everything. And so this will continue. And we have a lot of like more digital humanities stuff to do. So we're going to enhance the archive. We have more visual and material objects. So there's hopefully a clever way of sort of showcasing that. We have a few interviews already captioned. I'm going to show this when I talk you through the website. But we also have planned a lot of translations. So at the moment we have some interviews in French, but also in Hungarian, in Czech, one in Polish, etc., etc. And we want to really try and make it as accessible as possible and translate it into English, which seems still the most common language for these kinds of archives. And finally, 3 days ago, we received an email by the Khyentse Foundation. And we received the Ashoka grant. So we have 1 more year of funding. And let's go. Let's see what we can do with that. A few thank yous are in order. Professor Ulrike Roesler, the International Association for Tibetan Studies, also Charles, who was kind enough to let us host the website on the IETS network, the John Fell Fund for a massive fund, Oxford Center for Buddhist Studies, Wolfson College, Oxford, obviously, Robert Howe Foundation and Khyentse Foundation, and all the interviewees. And without further ado, I'm going to jump up switch the live stream, and then we're going to show the video.
I'll wait for you.
Back in a sec.
Paul, thank you very much for agreeing to this project. We are very honored that we can be here with you for the Oral History of Tibetan Studies project at Oxford. And we would like to ask you about your life, as you know.
And I would like to tell you. I was in Oxford from, I think, 72 till I finally left Oxford at the beginning of 80. I spent a year out in the middle in Edinburgh, where I stood in for John Brockington, teaching Indian civilization and religions and things like that for a year while he was on sabbatical. I started doing Tibetan at that time, entirely taught myself. There was no Tibetan studies in Oxford when I first came to Oxford. I mean, none. This was before Michael Aris came. And I started learning Tibetan initially for one purpose only, in order to be able to cross-check the Sanskrit texts. And I quickly became aware, of course, that there's a vast amount in Tibetan. I don't mean indigenous Tibetan texts, I mean translations of Sanskrit texts in Tibetan, which are lost in Sanskrit. And so I originally started to learn Tibetan so I could access. And I can't describe to you the excitement in those days of knowing, for example, that Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka Karika had commentaries by Buddhapalita, by Bhavaviveka, and a commentary attributed to Nagarjuna himself, which simply weren't being studied by anyone because they were in Tibetan and they weren't in Sanskrit anymore. I can't describe to you the excitement of getting a Tibetan text and saying, ha ha, he's saying this. You know, there was very little use of Tibetan in the study of Madhyamaka back in the 60s and 70s. But it was only then after I'd done some Tibetan, I was using Tibetan, I used Tibetan in my doctoral thesis, but not very much, that Michael Aris turned up as a fellow of St. John's College. Michael and Sue, of course, and their children. I think one of them was born while he was in Oxford. And we got to know, Michael, I heard, was teaching Tibetan. I was going to teach a Tibetan. So I was with Michael's very first Tibetan language class. And it wasn't until Michael turned up that I actually learned to pronounce Tibetan. And we often forget this. And I've come across this particularly in the old days, with Eastern European Tibetologists who had never heard Tibetan being spoken. So you go to a conference and they would be talking about Slig Glog Grubspo and things like that. You know, of course, if you've not heard, Tibetan is incredibly difficult to pronounce unless you've learned it from someone who knows how to do it. And so it was from Michael that I learned how to pronounce Tibetan, which was the result that my pronunciation of Tibetan is appallingly bad even now. People sometimes say it's a little bit Bhutanese, and I've heard Tibetan say that my pronunciation is a reasonable attempt of a southern Englishman to speak with Lhasa dialect.
So how old was he at this time?
Would have been 13, 14. But it was so strong, his desire to learn Tibetan. This is what really is important, that he didn't stop wanting to understand all about the culture, all about the iconography, all about the religion, all that. And the monks encouraged him, the Catholic school, they encouraged him. And my mother, who I told you, was already interested in Tibet. So for birthday presents and Christmas presents, she wouldn't give him the odd toy. She'd go and root around in the Portobello market in London, and she'd buy these amazing Tibetan things from the refugees who were leaving Tibet at that time. There was a big diaspora, big exodus from Tibet, mostly, I imagine, into India. but a lot of them must have been coming to London as well. So over the years, the twins collected a wonderful lot of things. And they got really interested in I think they both did. Michael particularly, he was very good at languages. Anthony, much more artistic. He was much more interested in the artifacts, the iconography and all that. Michael's much more interested in the language itself. And I'm very proud to say, when they were 14, we went to the V&A, to the Victoria and Albert Museum, and Michael was talking to the curator of tankas. They took us to the reserve collection in Ealing. The museum had a reserve collection of tankas, and Michael was able to interpret them to the curator. Now, I might be making this up, but I remember being there, and it was unbelievable that it was so young. He'd already got so interested, really, really, really interested, and encouraged by my mother as well.
When you were at high school, did you maintain this interest in Asia? Or this intriguing feeling about?
No, I don't think so. I think it really started with another thing in Berkeley, or before, just before. After school, I went to Canada. I immigrated. I couldn't immigrate to the United States because they had a clause. So I went to Canada. I went first to the east, and then I went to the west, to Vancouver Island, because I wanted to be close to the Kwakiutl Indians. That interested me a lot. And then I worked as a lumberjack in the field, in the hills, and when the forest was burning, they kicked us out, several of us who were not in the union, and so I started to work in Vancouver in George V's hotel. And there I had a very important meeting. I was bringing whiskey to the rooms, and in one of the big rooms was a Chinaman with his family, and with the clinking of the whiskies in the room that I brought, he invited me for a drink, although I was just a servant, and during our talk he suddenly said to me, "You are at the wrong place, young man." And he was Chinese. I thought, well, what does he mean? And then he said, "Come to Berkeley. I'll find you a scholarship." Just like that. And I did. So I went to Berkeley, and this man was Zhao Yuanren. Yeah. Still today, people in China take their hats off in memory of this great, short, beautifully modest man. And I learned Chinese with him. And then my interest in Asia emerged. Yeah.
Gene Smith was also an extraordinary, he was larger than life, really. And he was very kind. He had a job at the Library of Congress, but as soon he had no private life as such. As soon as he came back from office, he would receive Tibetan, so the house would be filled with Tibetan who bring them, or Bhutanese who will bring them manuscript, and that's how I met the first Bhutanese, and bring him manuscript, and he would be reading, and I was like this, like totally amazed by his knowledge. I was just in the first year of PhD, I couldn't believe somebody like that existed. His mastery of the text, of the history of the lineage, of the literature was, And I was really in awe. And then I started doing my PhD, and he advised me so kindly. He never said, "Oh, you are just a young student, you're not interested in." At 4 o'clock, when you stay in his house, at 4 o'clock in the morning, every morning, you were woken up by he had a typewriter, and he was typing in Wiley Tibetan text from 4 to 7 every morning, and then take his breakfast, and then go to the Library of Congress office. He was a workhorse. Then in his garage, he had all the texts. In his room, he had some text, favorite text. In the garage, he had put all the text and it was his dear Mangaram who was helping him. And Mangaram is very important for the Tibetology, and I want him to be remembered, because not only he fed all of us, Tadeusz Gorubski, Elliot Sperling. I met so many people in Jinsma, and Mangaram was feeding us, and he was also going to get the books from the garage when we needed and all. So, and I'm very happy to see he has done very well for himself in life. So he was really a very important person, and we all loved him, and the dogs.
How was it staying with David Snellgrove? I also think that in his house you were involved in building the first stupa in England. Is it correct?
Yes,
Bonpo stupa?
Yes. And this was in Buckinghamshire, in his garden. And this was actually Tenzin who always interested in, by the way, he himself is an artist, and he draws. And he always interested in the architectural aspect of stupas, different type of stupas, and so on. He always have a pile on the drawing of these things. And he showed this to David. And the question was, can we build a small one in our garden? Yes. So he said, Tenzin who designed this stupa. And then I just participated into this work and the bricks and cement and all that. Yes.
Paul, we have a few concluding questions that we ask the same to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So the first is, personally, what has your career in Buddhist studies or Tibetan studies given to you?
My career?
Yeah. How is it?
Oh, pretty good income. No. I don't know. I mean, okay, are we emphasising here the word career? Or are we emphasising the content involved? I mean, my academic career, yes. I mean, the content of the study of things Tibetan, and it has given me, I'm almost sort of Buddhist approach to this. I mean, we are each of us a story, a developing story, a story that's not yet over. And my story, at any particular point at which we refer to it, is me at that point. So the story of me now, is a story which is built on all that I've done in Buddhist studies and in Tibetan studies. So what has it given me? It's given me.
Okay, so that was a bit of a collection of interesting bits and pieces, and also like subjects that some of these interviews cover. Nope. Okay. So if you all go to oralhistory.iets.info, you will end up here. So this is our website. We have at the moment 46 interviews, which is more than 200 hours of archival material. You can see all the people involved, our sponsors, the special thanks, and then this one here, up here, interviews, is the important button. So we've set up sort of like detail pages for all our interviewees. Some of those are not yet accessible. So bear with us. It will take some more time to make everything like publicly accessible. But if we go down to Mr. Paul Williams, for instance, I just wanted to show you sort of how you can maneuver through these interviews, because Paul's is, I think, like 4 hours and 20. And so, I mean, you could just sit down, get some snacks, or Renee and I, we did these timestamps. So you can just sort of click here and you will be sort of forwarded to like different sections of the video. And you can just like click any of the questions or topics. And then you can just, narrow it down to 10 minutes, maybe more manageable. We also have sort of inserted like biographies. We have full list of publications, and so Paul gave us all his like just the finest selection, really. So I think, for instance, this one here is he called changing hair. So yeah, so just feel free to sort of explore. For instance, here's a picture from Lhasa from 1985, and so all these little gems are tucked away. Some of the interviewees did not want to be on video, but we were allowed to record them, and then we transcribed them. So mainly Rachel Griffiths did all the transcription work, and that's like 40 to 50 pages sometimes. Maybe let's find Michael Thorsten Much. And so we also identified like subjects and themes that run through these interviews. Yeah, it shouldn't be that slow, I'm sorry. Here we go, okay. So the interview starts here. You have a table of contents, but you also can scroll down and the table of contents will sort of pop up, and then you can just maneuver through this super long list, or what you're looking for. So that's just a bit of a quick run through. Feel free to explore however you like, and yeah, we are really looking forward to any sort of suggestions, comments, remarks. Maybe somebody has like one photograph tucked away somewhere on his or her hard drive, and just like reach out to us. We are happy to hear from you. Great, that's us.
So it's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Lama Jabb to the podium, who will share his thoughts on the role of Tibetans in Tibetan studies with us. Lama hardly needs an introduction, but I'll do it nevertheless because it's the right thing to do. Dr. Lama Jabb, he got his doctorate here in Oxford and is therefore well known to most of you. His doctorate was meanwhile published under the title Oral and Literary Continuities in Modern Tibetan Literature. Lama is an expert in literary studies in general, classical and modern, And he is now the lecturer in Tibetan in the Faculty of Oriental Studies, and we are delighted to have him with us long term. So, Lama, the floor is yours. And I completely forgot to say, he's also the current head of the research cluster in Tibetan and Himalayan Studies here in the college at Wolfson. So it's this interdisciplinary research group, and Lama is currently the head.
Thank you very much, Ulrike, for that generous introduction. And thank you very much for everyone coming. And I'll be saying a resounding yes to what Ulrike said in her introduction, welcome speech, and also chiming in some of those aspects that we have seen that the great work Daniel and everybody has done. In my short speech. So the term Tibetan Studies, Pui-Rigpa, is a modern coinage, and as such, this field of knowledge was not identified in traditional Tibetan by traditional Tibetan scholars. For instance, the renowned Rini Ju, 10 Sciences, provides kind of Tibetan studies with infinite material in Tibetan language, but it does not even hint at such a discipline. The absence of this technical term, of course, does not mean that there was a total dearth of intellectual endeavors that it indicates or denotes. As Professor Ulrike Roesler pointed out already, Tibetans themselves had engaged in serious scholarly undertaking concerning Tibet and the Tibetan civilization long before the appearance of this specific designation in the 20th century. A celebrated verse by Tsongkhapa captures the Tibetan intellectual spirit. Rilam tamu shipi namshul tang, bjongli dambar harwi nyamyen tang, tsigjur tsalan kuwi ngakahwal sartang dana renchin namsumanang. Mental faculty capable of distinguishing subtle reasonings. Practice born of realizing textual discourse as instruction. And speech power versed in the art of composition shine out as three kinds of gems here upon the earth. Great Tibetan masters of both Bon and Buddhist traditions alike fuse deep learning, critical thinking, and writing with a compassionate spiritual practice, in whom philosophy and practice, or to put it in academic parlance, theory and praxis have not yet parted company. Hence, when identifying indispensable attributes of scholar masters, Tibetans always stress the fusion of three qualities. Tusam Gomsam, the trinity of learning, reflection, and contemplation. Kipzan Zangsam, the trinity of erudition, morality, and goodness. And Chertul Khtomsam, the trinity of teaching, debate, and composition. For the Tibetans, Satya Pandita, Longchen Ramjumba, Je Tsongkhawa, are some of those scholar poets endowed with these principal qualities. And as such, they are reverentially known as Gangchen Jamyang Namsam, the three manjushris of the land of snow. In the cited stanza, one of these manjushris, who practice what he preaches with such profound beauty, sums up the long Tibetan intellectual tradition that prizes erudition, critical analysis, and the ability to produce well-written work. In a way, alongside the cultivation of compassion, it singles out the intellectual rigor and wherewithal to compose literary masterpieces. It is this unique intellectual consciousness that has bequeathed to the modern Tibetans and us Tibetanists and the world at large an unfathomably immense body of literature on, to name just the 10 traditional Tibetan sciences, Buddhism, logic, medicine, language, arts and crafts, poetics, synonymy, prosody, dramaturgy, and astronomy and astrology. Despite the extraordinary endeavors of pioneering Western and non-Western, including Tibetans themselves, some of which we have seen, I don't think it is an exaggeration to say that we have barely scratched the surface of the raw material preserved in Tibetan language. So, by the way, I say this not to dishearten, but to inspire our scholarship. This is not dispiriting news, both for either the field of Tibetan studies or for our program here at Oxford. In fact, for us and the future explorers of Tibetan civilization, there are many uncharted territories to be explored and rich treasures to be revealed. There are plenty of opportunities for aspirant Tetuns, treasure revealers. The birth and the subsequent flourishing of Tibetan studies are, as Professor Ulrike already noted, unimaginable without Tibetan labor and intellectual agency, not to mention the crucial provision of the raw research material in the shape of both formed and unformed matter. It is apparent that all the great founding Tibetanologists, including Alexander Joma and George Roesler, relied heavily upon classical and contemporary Tibetan scholarship for their trailblazing academic achievements. So these are incredible, impressive, inspiring outcomes of interaction between Tibetans and foreign scholars. Tibetan scholars were vital for the establishment of Tibetan studies programs in the field in the first place, and their voices have breathed life into numerous magisterial works in languages other than Tibetan. This has been the case ever since Tibetan studies started to take root in Western academia. Okay, as time is of the essence, let me name only a few of these outstanding modern Tibetan scholars. Tibetan studies, as we know it, would be in an impoverished state had it not been blessed by their precious lives and minds. Gendon Chimpel's illuminating, engaging, beautifully crafted writing on Tibetan history, religion, language, literature, and Indian subcontinent, and British imperial practices are unprecedented in Tibetan intellectual development. Each piece of his writing is the product of critical thinking, acute first-hand observation, and rigorous evidence-based research. Professor Heather Stoddard would tell us, I'm sure would agree with me, I hope so. And his collaborations with the foreign scholars such as Rahul Sankrit Yayan and George Roesler were novel and productive. His work and life continues to inspire Tibetan intellectuals and give sustenance two noteworthy Tibetan studies scholarship in Tibetan and other languages as I speak. Namki Norbu is another pioneering Tibetan scholar whose prodigious work in Tibetan continues to galvanize students of Tibetan civilization. His clear, concise, insightful writing on ancient Tibet, born spiritual traditions, various aspects of Tibetan culture have enlightened Tibetanists and directed their research to this day. For instance, his Xiangdruk Lamig travel guide to the northern nomads, based on his 1953 travel journals, has served as a literary model for Tibetan essay writing, as well as historical and social exploration. Now it remains an invaluable text bearing witness to the rapidly vanishing Tibetan nomadic culture. Santan Garme. What can I say about a living Tibetan national treasure? Samten Karmela was one of those amazing young Tibetan intellectuals invited to London in 1961 under the Rockefeller scheme by Professor Snellgrove. For Tibetans, his scholarship is known for its non-sectarian, objective and unbiased scientific approach and piercing insight. He has written authoritative and illuminating works on Tibetan history, Bon and Buddhist philosophy and practice, the Tibetan national epic, and Tibetan mythology. This most distinguished professor has guided and given intellectual sustenance to so many scholars from so many countries for so many years. His life and work remain a constant source of insight and inspiration today. In case you're wondering about the identities of those flanking Kame Samtenla, they are his beloved son Ose and a very embarrassing superfan. There are many incredible Tibetan scholars inside Tibet who survived extremely harrowing times to nurture the next generation of Tibetan intellectuals. Donkar Lobzang Tenli, Horkang Sonam Pambar, Tsetan Shaptung, Chapel Tsetan Punchu, Tori Tsenam, Mugi Samdan, Setsang Lobzang Padan, Shangza Kesang Chuchi Jansen, Alak Bunja, Tondub Je, Alak Torshe, to name but very few, have educated tens of thousands of Tibetan students and authored numerous works in Tibetan studies. Their intellectual legacy helps sustain and fuel contemporary Tibetan studies scholarship in and outside Tibet. Likewise, there are many great Tibetan scholars in the Tibetan diaspora. I mean, there are too many, really, to even to attempt a brief list of them here. Tsipun Shagapa, Zhagzha Rinpoche, Lopun Tanzan Namtak Rinpoche, Samdong Rinpoche, Ganka Tsutum Kesang, Dawa Norbu, Jamso Tsering, Ke Dondu, Tsering Shikja, and Josi Dashi Tserang are some of these exceptional Tibetan refugee scholars who have contributed so much to the preservation of Tibetan culture in foreign lands and to the emergence and flourishing of Tibetan studies today. You might have noticed that there is a lack of female Tibetan voices in my brief roll call of eminent Tibetan scholars. This is one of the most serious drawbacks of both classical Tibetan scholarship and of the early evolutionary stage of Tibetan studies. Fortunately, this situation has changed over recent decades and is improving fast. There are brilliant Tibetan women scholars such as Pella, Yundun Tsomo, Pemo, Yangmon Tso, Yangdun Tonduv, Dashi Rabji, Lobzang Rabji, and Tsering Tsomo, who come from both Tibet and the diaspora. Their groundbreaking work addresses a diversity of subject matter ranging from Tibetan history, language, and literature to gender relations, human rights, and contemporary Tibetan politics. It is the wonder and wisdom of Tibetan language that gave birth to the Tibetan intellectual tradition in the first place, and then paved the way for the emergence and subsequent thriving of Tibetan studies in the modern age. In her Nobel lecture, Toni Morrison says, "We die. That may be the meaning of life. But we do language. That may be the measure of our lives." Doing Tibetan language lies at the heart of Tibetan studies, and this is why it is the axis upon which Tibetan and Himalayan studies at Oxford turns. This leads me to mention with immense gratitude and honor our late beloved Tibetan teacher, Gonkatsang Tsering D Gonkatsang, who we lost so suddenly and tragically in 2018. He was the founding Tibetan teacher who, with Professor Charles Ramble, started, or should I say, Ramninze, consecrated Tibetan and Himalayan studies here at Oxford by teaching Tibetan. Gantseren La was a proud Tibetan son of tumultuous times. The many upheavals and traumas Tibet experienced in the mid-20th century forged his life and vision. Gantseren La was born in 1951 in eastern Tibet and escaped to India in the late 1950s following the Chinese communist occupation of Tibet. He received his early education at Tibetan refugee schools and then went on to complete BA degrees at Indian universities and an MA at the University of Glasgow. He was a popular and influential teacher long before he came to Oxford. Many Tibetans still share their fond memories of him as a talented teacher and a caring headmaster of the Tibetan Children's Refugee School in Dharamsala in the mid-1980s. Gantseren La was a product of both Tibet and the Tibetan diaspora. And as such, he had a deep knowledge of and a passion for all things Tibetan. For 17 years, Gantseren La enlightened his Oxford students and enriched the intellectual lives of his colleagues with his honed pedagogic skills, translation expertise, and in-depth scholarship in Tibetan civilization. Most of all, he had an insatiable desire to teach Tibetan language in order to pass on to others the history, memory, wisdom, and worldview embedded within it. Because language enables communication and reveals the unknown, Tibetans call their cherished 30 consonants, such as Sumchu, the 30 illuminators. Gontsangla's greatest gift to us, his students and colleagues, is to have immersed us in Tibetan language. That unmolested Tibetan language, to borrow Toni Morrison's words again, that surges towards knowledge. And that lies at the heart of Tibetan studies here and elsewhere. As the life breath that makes the Tibetan intellectual voice audible, may Tibetan language endure and thrive in Tibet, at Oxford, and elsewhere until the end of time. Thank you.
It's now my enormous pleasure to welcome you all to the annual Aris Lecture, which we hold to celebrate and commemorate Michael Aris's and Anthony Aris's contributions to the field of Tibetan and Himalayan studies. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. David Pritzker, who will give this year's Aris Lecture. He's come to us from Chicago, where he's the director and chief curator of the Pritzker Art Collaborative. David is known, enlightenment. David is known to many of us in Oxford because he did his master's degree and his doctorate here. In the context of the 21st anniversary of the Tibetan Studies program, it seemed appropriate to have a speaker who is Oxford raised, Oxford bred, and through Oxford in his scholarship. So we are delighted to have you back and to hear about your latest research and activities. Dr. Pritzker's research to date focuses on two main areas, on Tibetan history and historiography, and on Tibetan art and material culture. His doctoral thesis investigated early Tibetan historical literature with a focus on a historical text which he had discovered himself in the Western Himalayas, and which turned out to have fascinating historical and stylistic resonances with early Tibetan poetry, historical poetry, epic poetry almost, from other parts of the Tibetan plateau. The other long-standing passion for Dr. Pritzker is Tibetan and Himalayan art. Having spent a large part of his childhood in Nepal, he has a close relationship with the culture of the Himalayas and Tibet, and he has traveled extensively in the region. Since the 1990s, he's been part of several teams exploring, documenting, and researching the Western Himalayas and early sites of the kingdom of Kugepurang in Western Tibet. Dr. Pritzker has curated several important exhibitions for the famous Rubin Museum of Art in New York, and his most recent activity as a curator was the exhibition Cultural Exchange Along the Silk Road, Masterpieces of the Tubo Period, which attracted more than 400,000 people to the Central Asian oasis of Dunhuang to see the show. His lecture today will be related to the theme of this exhibition and has the title Cultural Exchange Along the Silk Road, the Royal Court of the Tibetan Empire. David, the floor is yours. Please, let's give David a floor.
Hi, everybody. It's really such a great pleasure to be here and such an honor to give this lecture, the Aris Lecture. I've always felt a part of an important lineage from Michael and Anthony Aris down through Charles Ramble and Ulrike Roesler. And so really it's an honor to have this opportunity to come back to Oxford and to present to so many of you that are my friends and new faces as well. And also those of you who are online watching, it's nice to have you here as well. I'm sorry that we can't see each other in person, but I hope we can soon. My talk today is really, as Ulrike said, focused on this exhibition that I put together in Dunhuang in 2019. And it's really so exciting for me to share this with you all because it's something that I developed actually while I was here in Oxford, kind of workshopping, researching on the side of my DPhil thesis. When I had trouble writing my DPhil thesis, this was always a topic I could go to that kind of reinvigorated me. Oftentimes, when looking at the material culture and history of the Silk Road, narratives coalesce around centers in China, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean, with very little mention to Tibet. Cultural exchange along the Silk Road was one of the first exhibitions of its kind to focus on the material culture that was the patronage of the Tibetan royal court between the 7th and 9th century. Featuring more than 120 sets of objects from over 30 museums, archaeological institutions, and private collections from around the world, this exhibition used the lens of cultural exchange along the Silk Road to look at the material culture of the Royal Tibetan Court. The major loans of the exhibition came from the Pritzker collection in Chicago, from the Abegg Stiftung, a museum and training institute in Switzerland that houses one of the largest and most important textile collections in the world. But more than that, more than 20 institutions in China loaned to this exhibition, including the Palace Museum, the National Museum of China, the Shanxi History Museum, the Archaeological Institute in Urumqi and in Qinghai, as well as the collections in the Potala, all participated in this exhibition. We even got archaeological loans as far as Ali in West Tibet and Tsaparang. So the title of the exhibition was really fitting not only of the period that we were looking at, but also in putting together the exhibition. We also had loans from the Art Institute of Chicago, from the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, as well as from the Altani collection. A highlight of the exhibition is the cosmopolitan taste of the Tibetan royal court and its projection of power through the interpretation of ideas, technologies, and motifs from neighboring cultures, and the ways in which the Tibetan court interpreted these ideas and produced something that would be widely understood to a multicultural and multilingual culture, but also that was distinctly Tibetan. This exhibition was really something profound because of where it was held, in Dunhuang, in the oasis of Dunhuang along the Heshi corridor, because the objects went into immediate dialogue with both the environment as well as the mural paintings just across the river. In the process of forging an empire, the Tibetan aristocracy creatively appropriated the best that the surrounding cultures had to offer, and they partook in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of the times. The Tibetan court brought Buddhism from India and craftsmen from Nepal. They adopted advanced Chinese methods of imperial administration, astrology, and divination. And they invited doctors, scholars, artisans, and entertainers from the oasis kingdoms of Central Asia, all to participate in and help build the royal court. As a result, the Tibetan rulers adopted both the practices and motifs and regalia of kingship in the last light of late antiquity, drawing on diverse traditions from the Tang dynasty in the east all the way to Persia and even Mediterranean worlds in the west. This dialogue with the cultures and kingdoms of the Silk Road defined and gave color to the Tibetan royal court, and the objects selected for this exhibition exemplify the spirit and energy within the court during its rise to power, as they represent a distinctive Tibetan Central Asian style that was the synthesis of Indo-Iranian, Sasanian, Central Asian, and Tang Chinese models. So what I wanted to do today was to kind of take you through the exhibition a little bit, but of course there's not enough time to show you everything. A breakdown of the major themes and sections of the exhibition are as follows. We started with the dawn of the Yarlung dynasty and the prehistory of the Tibetan plateau, and then moved into the rise of the Pugyal Tsempo onto the stage of history. Then each section kind of went into a specific topic related to the royal court. The exhibition looked at royal regalia, the royal encampment and tents of silk and gold, the royal banquet, the royal hunt, and the cosmopolitan Buddha. The early Middle Ages was a period of great empires. Two of them, China and Byzantium, developed traditions that followed those of ancient civilizations. But Charlemagne's empire in Western Europe, the Arab Caliphate in the Near and Middle East, the Khazar state in Eastern Europe and Russia, and the Turkic, Uyghur, and Tibetan Kaganites of Western Central Asia were founded by peoples who had only recently appeared on the stage of history. I put this map up here because I think it gives a good idea in the early 8th century of all the various kingdoms and empire that surrounded Central Asia. The map as it's drawn here of Tibet changed radically over the course of the 7th to 9th century as the Tibetans expanded their empire to include the Taklamakan and the Tarim Basin, but also the Turkic Empire and the Chinese Empire all competed for control of the lucrative Silk Road along the way. The first section, the dawn of the Yarlung dynasty, was really an opportunity just to touch on some of the early prehistory of Tibet and some of the archaeological finds that have been discovered recently. This gold mask, single agate bead, and silk presented here are emblematic of the connections between the Tibetan plateau and its surrounding regions during the early period. Such masks represent a shared cultural system in the high Himalayas and across the nomadic and semi-nomadic regions of Inner and Central Asia, as well as the Central Plains and the Eurasian steppe. The presence of such gold masks give evidence to a vast cultural complex made possible by the opening of the Silk Road, in which mortuary practices linked to concepts of social status and ideas of immortality were able to spread. In particular, Tibet was closely engaged in what Christopher Beckwith has called the Central Eurasian Cultural Complex, in which he wrote, "These are a collection of cultural elements shared by the peoples of pre-modern Central Eurasia that goes back to the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Among these common traits were similarities in each group's myths of origin, which often centered on a heroic leader and a war band of friends who created the personal guard of the king. In this way, the Lord and his comitatus formed the heart of every newborn Central Eurasian empire." I only show one mask here, but actually we had multiple gold masks in the exhibition. But this group of objects comes from Tsaparang in West Tibet. And in fact, this silk, dated to the 2nd, 3rd century, is one of the earliest silks found on the Tibetan plateau and really is a testament for the Tibetan plateau's engagement in the Silk Road long before we have any written history. The period of the Yarlung dynasty was one of the most important epochs in Tibetan history. At this time, the royal nomadic court was at its military height, controlling a massive territory that extended well beyond the high plateau. Through conflict, trade, and assimilation, the Tibetan court generated a huge amount of creativity and ingenuity. This largely fueled with contacts with neighbors to the north, south, east, and west, created many of the social, political, technological, and religious foundation of Tibet's subsequent history. For this reason, the Tibetan Empire and the Tibetan Tsempo, its mighty rulers, have come to be regarded as the heroic golden age of Tibet. For those of you not so familiar with early Tibetan history, I just want to put up here some basic anchor points in understanding Tibet's rise to power. So in the very beginning of the 7th century, and actually in the late 6th century, Namri Songtsen consolidated the clans around central Tibet and sent 2 emissaries to the Sui court in China. And this really marks the emergence of the Tibetans on an international stage. Then Songtsen Gampo, perhaps Tibet's greatest ruler and Tsempo, expanded Tibet's power well beyond the Yarlung Valley, and in a matter of a decade, really expanded the empire in all directions. For a few generations, the Tibetan court was incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful, but of course it shrank with the competition, as I mentioned, between the Turks and the Chinese for the Silk Road. But then Trisong Detsen reasserted the power that Songtsen Gampo had formed, expanding the empire even further into the Heshi corridor, into Dunhuang, and really controlling the Silk Road for a time. And so I also list the Tibetan period in Dunhuang, which you can see overlaps with the time of Trisong Detsen. And it's at this time that the sort of major influence of Buddhism comes into Tibet. This is a photo from one of the caves in Dunhuang, cave 158. It's one of the more famous caves of Dunhuang. It's on almost all the brochures and advertisements of Dunhuang, and it's a Tibetan cave. How do we know that? This Parinirvana scene is all the mourners coming to mourn the passing of the Buddha. And at the end, at the foot of the Buddha, are the donors and entourage of this cultural exchange that made up the Tibetan royal court. You can see this is an early photo by Paleo, and the cave is somewhat destroyed since this time, not destroyed totally, but this is the best photo really, I think. And within this group, you can see all that multicultural and multilingual group that came together to participate in the Tibetan court. Down below here, these 2 figures are really different groups within the Tibetan plateau, particularly in eastern Tibet, the Sumpa people and Aja. Above them, you can see an Indian sadhu, and above the sadhu, even Turkic and Uyghur participants, all part of the court. To their side is the Chinese emperor, but at the top of the whole procession is the Tibetan Tsempo. Represented here, all of them are mourning, so they all have this face of grief on them. But the Tibetan Tsempo, with his wife next to him, is wearing a long silk robe patterned in very typical Central Asian style. And he's in between 2 trees, quite a common iconographic motif of the Pure Land Buddha. And on his head is the typical Tibetan head wrap, but he also wears a crown. So there's a whole combination of the Tibetan ruler as king, but also as Chakravartin. And we'll come back to this later on. A key to understanding the objects on display is to consider their presentation within a highly performative and ritualized context. More specifically, the idea of divine kingship offers a powerful tool for the study of these objects, and indeed early Tibetan history and art as a whole. In almost all the objects presented here, the ancient kings are not represented in explicitly Buddhist terms. Rather, their depictions echo an archaic vision that can be found in much of Central Asia and the ancient Near East. The presentation of divine kingship in Tibet served to ancestralize the Tibetan king and confer upon him the charisma of his office. This charisma was presented in the various formulaic motifs and visual topoi that were central to the culture's ideas of power and divinity. This is just a detail from a much larger silk, where the Tibetan king is not presented at all in a Tibetan fashion, but much more of an Indo-Iranian figure. In fact, what's quite unusual about this piece is both the crown of the king has a very typical Sasanian winged crown, which becomes also emblematic of the crown of the king in Tibet. And he's also holding two flowers, both iconographic elements of Surya, the sun god at the time in India. So Surya and the whole solar dynasty and its influence also on Tibetan kingship is quite powerfully shown in this fragment. But I want to talk a little bit more about the use of kingship and divine kingship in understanding the objects that were brought for display in Dunhuang. And I'm going to use this example of a gold repoussé quiver plate. So this would have attached onto a wooden quiver. Here you can see the rider, the Tibetan king, in typical Central Asian kaftan, the lapels nicely embroidered, and on his side, the quiver that this object actually is part of. He's in full gallop in a hunt of the lion. Now, lions are not found on the Tibetan plateau, but still the lion imagery at this point, traveling from the Roman Empire all the way through to China, became synonymous with kings. And in fact, even during Roman times in the Colosseum, the lion and such animals were reserved only for the right of the king to kill. We even know that lions were given as gifts to the Tang court by travelers from Tajikistan. And there's no reason to think that such gifts wouldn't have been given within the Tibetan court. Here, the rider, also again, I'll point out the winged crown and flowing scarves, also a symbol of divine kingship. The rider's in full gallop, and the scene that's depicted is really at the height of the moment of the hunt. The lion as well is roaring up in fleeing from the horse and rider, but the two are actually connected together. The power of the lion and the power of the rider are joined together quite literally through the spear. So as we begin to look at these objects and the imagery, while at first glance they look familiar, we can actually see deeper meaning imbued within them. Another similar example, this is a Tang Dynasty phoenix. It's actually quite small, maybe about this large, and it would have been inset into a box. But here we have a Tang phoenix, and it's, I think, a good example of how the Tang aesthetic permeated within their crafts and arts of their court. The phoenix here shown dancing a little bit, kind of flying in the sky with its wingtips up, and is very carefully and delicately done. That's quite typical of Tang art. Even the miniature size goes towards what I would say is a daintier aesthetic within the Tang court. In comparison, the Tibetan phoenix, you can see the use of space is really voluminous. The tail feather of the phoenix is quite large behind the phoenix, and he stands proud, feet firmly planted, and the wings of the Tibetan phoenix are almost always down, the tips down, much more in line with a raptor or carrion bird than with this mythical bird. So you can see the aesthetics of the Tibetan nomadic court within the phoenix, I think, is a great emblematic example because of the power that's imbued within the object. Royal regalia. In Western Eurasia, gold and silver had long served as diplomatic gifts. From the late Roman period, we can find gold and silver objects with inscriptions or decorations that identify them as imperial, exemplified by commemorative dishes, silver ingots, as well as rings and fibula. A list of such gifts from the Tibetan court sent to the Nanzhao kingdom list, among many things, a gold crown, an embroidered robe, a belt decorated with gold and precious stones, saddles, utensils, pearls, carpets, clothes, camels, and horses. Such gifts are a part of the powers of Eastern Eurasia, which adopted such practices, probably through Central Asian intermediaries. Gold and silver objects, and in particular, luxury gold and silver vessels, all played a central role among the personal gifts that accompanied diplomatic correspondence. So in this section of royal regalia, I tried to paint a picture of some of the fashion of the royal court. This phenomenal robe in the collection of the Abegg is both a very early example of Sasanian or Sogdian silk within the Tibetan court, and is also quite an unusual garment, not typical of the Central Asian kaftan. In fact, this robe is really more like a cape. The arms are false arms, and it pins just at the neck. And you can see an example of that robe on this rider. I should also let you know that a lot of these images that I'm using of the Tibetan court come from a coffin painting, which has been published by Amy Heller, and is a great tool for moving through these important life scenes of the Tibetan royal court. Within this section of royal regalia, we had many silks on view, as well as jewelry, a beautiful brooch of turquoise and crystal and carnelian, a very thick pure gold bracelet with confronting elephants and aquamarine stone, a belt inlaid with turquoise, and a belt ornament. Also, as you start to look at images of Central Asian kaftans, you'll often see this small bag. The royal encampment, tents of silk and gold. The tradition of holding annual assemblies by the Tsempo and the leading clans of Tibet lasted throughout the imperial period. One important feature of the Central Eurasian or Turco-Mongol banquet was the setting. The event took place within a tented encampment where the host and his guests sat cross-legged on carpets. It was an ancient steppe custom to hold court in a large, elaborately decorated tent. As pastoral nomads, Turco-Mongol rulers relied on mobile forms of visual pageantry, such as impressive tent where they held court. In the Middle Ages, the golden tent became a ubiquitous symbol of kingship across Central and Eastern Eurasia. The Tibetans, Turkic Khagans, and Abbasid caliphs all shared in this custom, which served as the symbolic center of the respective capitals. Even Charlemagne, emperor of the Franks, had an equivalent in his golden dome used for coronations. These courtly tents tended to be huge, and with some recorded to easily accommodate more than 100 people. Known as the Golden Tent, these royal structures were lavishly decorated with gold and luxury textiles, especially silk. For this exhibition, we were able to bring together two of the largest Central Asian silks in the world, both Tibetan. This silk is more than 6 by 6 feet in size and was made on a single loom. Again, one of the elements that makes it distinctively Tibetan is both the thickness of the silk that was used to make this silk, in contrast to Tang Dynasty silks or other silks found along the Silk Road. But also, once again, the larger-than-life forms of the tree of life, of the confronting deer, and the way that the floral motif is done, all indicative of a Tibetan Central Asian aesthetic. When put together, these two massive silks form only part of a much larger room in which to hold the royal court. And in fact, we know of a number of other parts of this set of silks that would have created a room in which to hold the court. But the Tibetans took it even further. You would think that these silks would be what was the main visual cue, but in fact, most of the silks were actually covered in thin gold, silver repoussé plaques. And we've been able to find, really through the research of the scholars at the EPHE, where these pieces would have attached to silk. Here you can see a gold plate done to look like silk, but once again is done in gold. The royal banquet. Among the important tasks that went into building the court of the Tibetan Sempo were the certain rites and rituals that were adopted to mark great occasions that underpinned the authority of the ruler and his royal assembly. Matrimonial alliances, gift-giving, banquets, and royal hunts were all among the panoply of the court. Royal hunts, for example, were not simply a means of food collection. Rather, they were an opportunity to display one's martial agility and the ability to coordinate troops. Similarly, banquets functioned as a display of wealth and power, as well as a time to renew allegiances and reaffirm legitimacy through oath swearing. Both the hunt and the banquet, as well as coronations, marriages, sacrifices, and burials, offered occasions to ceremonially cement the foundations of the empire, and this is what gave rise to the deluxe material culture. In pre-modern societies, ceremonial drinking, oath swearing, and feasting all helped to build and strengthen the patron-client relationships. Towards late antiquity, the elite of great empires such as Rome and Sasanian Iran used banquets to participate in the wider celebration of the sovereign's power and achievements. Various elements of the banquet, such as protocols, attendance, seating, and dining arrangements, were all carefully refined and choreographed to form a common focus of competition, display, and debate. Ceremonial drinking and feasting were no different in ancient Tibet. In fact, the Iranian royal ceremony of the wine banquet found its way into the Tibetan court, and this transfer most likely resulted from shared interactions with the Turkic Khaganate, and even more directly from Sogdian traders and merchants and artists. Given Tibet's proximity to Central Asia, it is more likely that the Tibetans learned about the images as well as the institutions of Sasanian royal banquets from these intermediaries. These ancient traditions assimilated many common practices of the contemporary Eurasian elites so that the splendor of the Tibetan court was easily recognizable to a multicultural audience far beyond the Tibetan plateau proper. This is a dish from the Hermitage, Sogdian silver dish, but a good example. Having had a long history in Western Central Asia, the royal banquet as an imperial political institute is similarly represented in a number of mediums to show an ideal of kingship with carefully selected and choreographed visual elements, such as the royal banquet scenes we see depicted on Sogdian silver, as well as well-known Sogdian funerary couches of Anqi and Yuhong. As a rule, a high-ranking person is seated on a carpet or a divan holding a drinking cup and is surrounded by attendants and entertainers. Another key focus of the banquet is the ewer, the wine vessel that would go around pouring wine into everybody's cup. And this is a topic that I've written on extensively elsewhere, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But for the exhibition, we were able to bring together some of the most important ewers around the world, all sharing a similar history of the wine banquet. Here we have a Greco-Bactrian ewer, most likely created in the sort of Indo-Iranian and Greek communities in northern India and Afghanistan, but then finding its way to China. An incredible, I think, Turkic ewer. One of a kind and really one of the largest ewers in the world, a pure gold Tibetan ewer, a highlight of the exhibition and a focus of an earlier article of mine. A much simpler Sogdian silver ewer, and two Chinese ceramic ewers. What was so wonderful about having all of these objects in the exhibition in one place was you could see both the shared culture of royal courts and the wine banquet, but at the same time the distinctive aesthetics of each court, all on view in one place. It really helped inform the discussion and conversation of the audience moving through the exhibition to see both the diversity and similarity between these objects. The Tibetan Rider's Cup is also a perfect example of the kind of minor arts which had a long cultural and historical journey and engagements across Eurasia. Such central objects to the ideas of the heroics and power, the Rider's Cup became an essential part of the cosmopolitan world that Tibet joined and participated in between the 7th and 9th century. As an essential feature of the warrior's garb, the cup was a symbol of his or her chivalric lifestyle and the power, as well as the refinement of his station. Across Central Asia, such cups were recognized as both refined and foreign, ultimately having Sogdian and Greco-Iranian roots, but nonetheless local. In this way, the Tibetan Rider's Cup is an example of both the internationalism with which the Tibetan court engaged, as well as exemplary of the Tibetan aesthetic as distinctive from the Tang, Sogdian, and Turkic Kagans, or those of the oasis kingdoms of the Heshi Corridor and the Taklamakan. The basic idea of a cup with handle is an ancient and nomadic one. Herodotus describes the Scythians as having cups suspended from their belt or harness strap, a handy design for their mobile lifestyle. But the ornaments and the design, and especially the loop handle with cloud-shaped thumbpiece, evoke Sogdian silver objects identified by Boris Marshak. As in the case with Tang gold and silver, these handled cups are evidence of Sogdian influence on Tibetan metalwork during the time of the Pugyal Tempo. However, the Tibetan cups do not have direct parallels among the Sogdian examples, which usually have a cylindrical or octagonal body and are hammered from sheet metal rather than cast. The ornaments, as can be seen in the present example, also have distinctive characteristics that allow us to identify them as Tibetan, even though they share many of the features with their Sogdian prototypes. The Tibetan commitment to animal motifs on their ceremonial objects exhibits great specificity in the use of visual language. Both the artists and the patrons of Tibetan metalwork use the placement, posture, and demeanor of figural forms to communicate particular narratives. Whether depicted in full gallop, prancing or seated, upright roaring or falling prey to the arrow of a hunter, dancing across meadows or soaring in the sky, each animal motif is carefully and deliberately placed according to the type, function, and even owner or consumer of the object. The specificity of such imagery provides a context for the use of allegory within the iconographic composition of the vessel itself. An interesting interpretive methodology that can be applied to the iconography of Tibetan minor arts was first suggested by the late Boris Marshak while working on similar objects from the Tibetan Plateau and Central Asia. Marshak showed that despite the strong commitment in Tibetan Terutics to animal imagery over that of figural or textural scenes, as was common in Sasanian and Greek objects, there's an enormous amount of allegorical narrative imbued within the animal and floral imagery, which has been freely adapted to meet the tastes of the Tibetan patrons. As pointed out by Marshak, the animal figures not only work in concert with each other, interacting, playing, chasing each other, and so forth, but are also individually filled with emotive meanings, the combination of which can be the result of a significant allegorical narrative. As in the art of the Sasanian Empire, where pictorial displays of kingship through hunts, banquets, and investiture scenes is filled with motifs and topoi central to the culture's ideas of power and divinity, so does the animal imagery in Tibetan metalwork convey its culturally specific significance. The compositions here are original, but one can find parallels in Tang China and Central Asia, which in their own turn were inherited from the ancient Near Eastern cultures, and in their turn from classical Western antiquity. The iconographic programs regularly exhibited motifs of royalty, fidelity, guardianship, and the heavenly afterlife. And the animals and motifs that decorate the objects convey the ideas of enlightenment and playfulness, power and meek serenity. The images act in concert with one another, each one with their own significant, each other, and are in effect a group of talisman, each with their own as well as their combined meaning. And I want to go into this a little bit in detail in this cup that I'm showing. On this Tibetan cup, there are 4 repoussé elements that form a network consisting of 4 flat raised fields above a flat background. Each field is occupied by the relief figure of an animal. An attacking lion alternate with a hybrid mythic deer. Both images portray Tang models, but are distinctive of Tibet. One compositional peculiarity must be analyzed here because it would have been the key to the significance of this particular object as a whole, and a clue also in how we might better understand similar objects. I'm going to go back a second to go through this. Within the interior scene, we find an unexpected but revealing composition. Depicted on the bottom is a water basin inhabited by 3 fish surrounded by lotuses. 3 concentric lines interlacing with the lotus stems frame the shore of the basin. A mandarin duck is placed on each lotus, and the stems rising from the small flowers form arches above the mandarin ducks. This composition is original, but as I mentioned, has its roots elsewhere. A gilded spiral on the bottom depicts the water basin, and a swirl consisting of 3 gilded fish occupies not only the wet zone indicated by the spiral, but also the dry part of it. Everywhere in Central Asia, it was quite common to depict fish at the bottom of a bowl. But in this case, it's not as simple. Here, the artist has illustrated a specific story and therefore individualized the fish. All 3 of their heads are placed inside the spiral of the water, but their tails are in the dry area. 2 have human-like faces, the sides along their bodies carefully drawn. However, the 3rd fish is twisted and floating upside down, perhaps because he is dying or already dead. This is a visual version of the tale of the 3 wise fish, or rather the tale of the wise fish, known both in Indian and Sogdian literature. According to the Sogdian variant of this tale, in a drying pool lived 4 fish. The wisest of them possessed 1,000 thoughts. The second, 100, the third, 10, and the fourth, only 1. The last one observed that the pool was drying up. This fish informed the others and then escaped. But the 3 learned fish despised their advice of their simpler companion, and they stayed and perished. Perhaps the most learned fish is shown here already dead, face down in the water. It, along with the 2 other human-faced fish, symbolize in the tale false wisdom and arrogance. Is it possible, therefore, to explain the significance of the whole set of images? The cup was a permanent attribute of the warrior, both at his mouth and at his belt. The imagery is heraldic. We see a lion, a heroic and also royal animal, pursuing a hybrid heavenly deer, which here also looks more similar to a one-horned horse with small wings, a kind of Pegasus. The latter is a symbolic image of a noble woman. The mandarin ducks in neighboring China symbolizes the lifelong fidelity of husband and wife. Thus, the cup with handle could be made for a wedding, and perhaps not for the wedding banquet alone, but for the married life after it and up to the other life, symbolized by the lotuses. The ducks descending on double-stemmed flowers on the outside decoration further emphasizes the significance of the inner side composition, where both motifs are employed. The donor supplied his gift with good advice to his friend who is about to be married. Be modest, leave false wisdom aside, and value the everyday common sense. This illustration could only have been done under the influence of a Sogdian artist, yet the composition is distinctly Tibetan. One of the great surprises of the exhibition was to bring 2 objects together, which I had long suspected belonged together because they look so similar. But in fact, when we got both of these pieces together in two separate collections across the world, I was able to place the cup in the middle of the saucer, and it fit perfectly within the tendrils of the lotus. So once again, while these objects are all around the world, for this time in Dunhuang, we were able to bring these two back together again. The royal hunt. Everywhere in Eurasia, successful hunts, like feasts, were prestigious social events. Royal hunts provided an opportunity for the military class to show off their bravery and martial skills as archers and as riders. And banquets demonstrated the wealth that such martial virtue achieved. The depiction of powerful, beautiful, and wary animals on personal belongings were symbols of divine and royal power that were expected to be shared with the superb qualities of the animals and the owners of the object. Here's one of the few Sasanian examples we were able to bring into the exhibition just to show the importance of the hunt, but also of minor arts within royal courts. The royal hunt was not simply a means of gathering food, but was rather a huge exhibition of martial agility. Here we have depicted a royal hunt within Tibet. Now, to give you an idea of what a royal hunt was, hundreds, if not thousands, of cavalry would, over days and weeks, corral animals from across the plateau into a central hunting field. Then, when the time was right, a huge hunt would take place, and this would have been a wild event. In this depiction, the wild yak, or zhong, is really the larger-than-life object or animal, and is once again closely connected with the Tibetan king. Even from old Tibetan documents in Dunhuang, we can see this relationship between the king and the wild yak. When one early king challenges his court, asking who will take this position of the wild yak and challenge him in a fight. Here you can see both the chainmail used, as well as the herders and dogs that would chase the animals into the hunt. As many of you know, or as you might have seen if you've participated in a horse race in the Himalayas, in the Tibetan Plateau or Mongolia, these are wild and dangerous events. No one is sure to survive on their horse in such events. And we even see laws being made in Dunhuang manuscripts around the royal hunt to coordinate this event. Here you can even see one rider stabbing into the horse of another rider that's being eaten or mauled by a tiger. In this area of the royal hunt, we also had a lot of objects related to the horse, saddles, saddle equipment, other armaments that I can't include here, but I wanted to include this one Tibetan quiver because this is, I believe, a used object as opposed to simply a ceremonial object. It's made of birch bark, so it's incredibly light. So when connected onto your belt, it really would not have weighed so much. And here in the center, we can see the rider, again, dressed in Central Asian silk, the famous sort of Sogdian pearl rondelles on his vest. And even this idea of the pearl rondelle transfers to so many of these objects, and you can see the nailing around also showing off this kind of pearl motif. But we were also able to get another quiver from Xinjiang, a Uyghur quiver, with a similar hunt scene depicted. This was only the second time this object had ever been viewed and displayed, and the first time was in a very obscure catalog that I found. I thought we were going to get a full-size quiver. But when it arrived in Dunhuang, it was this big, a tiny model of a quiver. And we thought, oh, okay, this is exciting. But once again, a burial object showing the importance of such military wear. The final section of the exhibition was focused on Buddhism. Most of the sections of the exhibitions didn't focus on Buddhism at all. And this was quite deliberate because even though Buddhism becomes a central focus in Tibetan studies later on, the Dalai Lamas, the incredible monasteries and patronage of Buddhism in Tibet, for the early part of the Tibetan Empire, it's not clear how important Buddhism was. But of course, as the Tibetan court grew in importance and engaged internationally, Buddhism was the dominant religion of the kings and is also a very subjugating kind of religion, so perfect for a royal court. I placed images of Buddhas and bodhisattvas at different parts of the exhibition and tried to blend these themes together. But the last section focused on Buddhism and also on Buddhism in Dunhuang. Over the course of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, the Silk Roads of Inner Asia played an important role not only in commerce and cultural exchange, but also in the transfer and transformation of philosophical and religious ideas. In much of this region, Buddhism and features of Buddhism's Indian cultural background became well established and widespread. The dominant languages of this region were those of Indo-Iranian family, and knowledge of Sanskrit was fairly widespread and common, particularly among the educated Buddhist clergy that moved across the Silk Road. Tibet's occupation of the Tarim Basin and the adjacent areas within Inner Asia privileged the Tibetan participation in a generally Indianized way. And notably, Buddhist culture was the international culture at the time. There's no doubt that this engagement and interaction became an important source for the early transmission of Buddhist doctrine to Tibet. So in this last section, we brought objects from around Tibet that the Tibetan court would have imported into their royal court. A very large Vajrapani from Nepal, a Gupta Buddha from India, a very similar bronze, but more likely made in Nepal and brought to Tibet, and a large Kashmiri Buddha within the Potala's collection. But once again, in organizing this exhibition and working with Dunhuang Academy, I came to discover that the Academy itself has a very sizable collection of Tibetan material, objects that ended up in the care of Dunhuang Academy during the Cultural Revolution. These objects were part of the destruction of the Cultural Revolution in Tibet, and they made their way across Tibet into China and ended up somehow in the care of Dunhuang Academy. Both of these objects are larger than life-size bronzes from the 9th century. And here we can begin to see the Indian forms. And really, I would like to make a mention to my friend and a friend of Oxford who passed recently. Yuri, as many of you know, was a scholar of the Indian Buddhism in the Heshi corridor. And it was really Yuri that pointed out how Buddhism traveled along the maritime Silk Road up into China and into Dunhuang, and from there back into Tibet. And both of these objects display this same Indian form of Tantric Buddhism, which came from Tamil Nadu area, from the Pallava kingdom at that time, with translators and monks into the Heshi corridor where Tibet engaged. And you can see here the tiered crown of the Chakravartin and of Vairocana, also depicted on the crown of the Tibetan temple in Dunhuang. And we can see also this Indian form developing in Tibetan caves, both in Yulin and Dunhuang, the 8 bodhisattvas around Vairocana, and a very distinctive iconographic element of this form and practice of Buddhism depicted in these mural paintings. So, with Tibetan engagement in Dunhuang, we see a synthesis start to happen of Nepalese craftsmen in Buddhism, Indian Buddhism from the Gangetic Plain, as well as from South India, and its transfer up to Dunhuang and back to Tibet. In particular, we can see that mix in this Vajrapani, most likely cast by a Nepalese artist, but showing clear signs of this southern Indian style, as well as some of the Tang modeling that you find in Dunhuang. We found a very similar bronze, once again from the collection in Lhasa at the Potala, both exact same dimensions and sizes, and probably a part of a set of 8 bodhisattvas. Here you can also see from a banner from Dunhuang, I believe this is in Paris now, but again, this shared style. Notice the earrings that are like petals on the ear, the necklace, the crown, all very similar with each other. There's so much more I want to share with you of this exhibition, so many facets and interesting areas to dive into, but we don't have enough time. I brought with me a catalog of the exhibition to share with all of you and to put in the Bodleian, and also a copy with Ulrike for the Tibetan Studies department. But I just want to show you quickly some of the images of the exhibition, some of the ways that we moved viewers through the exhibition, and the ways that we mixed the objects together to touch on all these various themes at different points in the exhibition. This was truly a one-in-a-lifetime opportunity, putting this exhibition together, working with Dunhuang Academy, working with the Cultural Relics Bureau in China, and with all the various lenders internationally. And I just want to thank also the team of people that helped put this exhibition together in Dunhuang and from abroad. We really came together and put it together in a very quick but careful manner. Thank you all very much.